Hello there everyone. So this video was going to be uploaded last week, but yeah, it didn't happen, and a large part of the reason why it didn't happen was because I have been working some pretty long hours lately. Also, I'm working on 4 different scripts at the same time. 2 of them aside from this one are either done or close to being done, so like I said in my community post earlier this month, there is a lot of content which is coming out pretty soon here, and I am standing true to my word on that. But anyway, I found this tweet the other day, and by found, I mean that somebody posted it in the Back Alley Discord, and I happened upon it because I find Twitter as a platform to be completely fucking insufferable. It's the worst parts of Tumblr and Reddit fused together with a layout that's worse than either of them, except maybe or any other social media site that I could think of for that matter, except maybe Facebook. Plus, Twitter just had an update recently, as you can see, which made the layout even clunkier. I mean, it's as if the platform is being killed off deliberately at this point. Now, I hope you guys can see why I think that. Also, I generally am skeptical of social media as a model of platform, but I digress because I'll need an entire separate video to explain my reasoning behind holding that position, and indeed I plan on actually making one sometime this month or maybe next month, just generally soon, so stay tuned for that one if you're interested. Anyway, so the official Libertarian Party Twitter account decided back on February 1st, because February is Black History Month, to post the following tweet. Quote, "As we begin celebrating Black History Month, let us never forget the brave Black Panthers that stood by their rights in the 60s, staunchly opposing oppressive police brutality and the Mulford Act, a gun control bill signed by Ronald Reagan and supported by the NRA to disarm them." Now, I still am incredibly skeptical of the Libertarian Party for various reasons. Libertarianism is a philosophy which specifically acts as a refutation to the concept that there can be a legitimate political rule. So, a Libertarian Party inescapably negates its own premise. If it's a party, then it has to use coercive means to achieve its ends in the form of state-issued legislative fiat, and as a state organization, its interests are fundamentally entangled with those of the state, which means that its organizers and politicians have the same collective interests with all other state actors and state organizations. In other words, the function of such an organization is inherently in conflict with its purported principles, and therefore is incapable of reaching its goals. You cannot simply have a society where political rulers aren't coercing people. That was established as a result of threatening people with coercive violence on a systemic level, in other words, legislating. And even if this disconnect between necessary characteristics of being a state-associated political organization trying to influence the state's legislative fiat and the desired ends, along with the stated principles of libertarian philosophy, didn't exist, the interests as a state actor which any Libertarian Party politician has make it incredibly unlikely that they'd follow any commitment to their claimed principles, as they'd have nothing but direct disincentives associated with doing so, and in many cases, direct impossibilities. I could go on, but what I wanted to talk about was both the response that this tweet invoked and also the content of the tweet itself, because this tweet, I believe, unintentionally but nonetheless ended up unwittingly creating a deconstruction of politics as actual libertarian philosophy is supposed to do, and the replies to this tweet from people of various different so-called pro-political affiliations reflect this. So firstly, let's start off by addressing what the Black Panther Party actually did in its relation to the Mulford Act. I doubt that the movement's ideology, their stated conclusions or goals, and how they tried to achieve those ends really needs any explanation, and even if they did, if you were to go to the comments under this tweet, you'd see a bunch of triggered so-called minarchists and circle-jerking Marxists explaining it in greater detail than I need to or will hear. If something you're defending has Marxist leanings, or you enjoy some media, maybe espouse ideas created or conceived of by someone which happens to have Marxist leanings, even if your argument, the media in question, or the subject you're defending has inherently nothing in context to do with Marxism, and this information is completely irrelevant to your argument, you better fucking believe that an obnoxious swarm of neo-Tumblrites are going to flood your comments and turn it into the front page of r/gatekeeping to remind you that it did in fact have origins with an organization or person that happened to have Marxist leanings. Don't know why that's such a common theme with those types, but then again, these are the same people who cite the dictionary definition of communism, i.e., how Karl Marx described the ideal conclusion of his philosophy, as a rebuttal to criticism of how Karl Marx arrived at his conclusion. So, not exactly the kind of people who understand any sort of effective argumentation we're dealing with. But yes, as many people already know, the Black Panther Party, despite the title, was not actually a state-connected political organization, but a grassroots, mostly black nationalist and neo-Marxist inspired separatist movement, which obtained funds mainly through voluntary donations, selling books, and trading labor among many other services, which they provided in the aims of creating a subversive community model that reduced the dependence of those who associated within it on government agencies and firms in the US government's political economy, but also so they could fund a service which was referred to as cop watching, which is where the Black Panthers obtained most of their controversy from. This is when Black Panthers, members of the Black Panthers organization, would patrol the streets, so they'd drive around in cars or vans, and would use force. They would take up arms, and they would threaten or shoot at police who were harassing people or assaulting people. So this was essentially an attempt to try and put a check on the state, which of course, with the state being the state and depending on extortion, using threats of violence to socially engineer people into engaging in certain behaviors or associations which are otherwise not in their perceived interests, they were fucking furious. Which resulted in the signing of the Mulford Act, a legislative decree which would threaten Black Panther members specifically with violence for owning guns or by operating within the aforementioned subversive communities, even though said legislation used the cop watching as a justification for it being established into the legal code. But if that apparent disconnect between what the bill actually says and the stated justification for its passing didn't already clue you into the fact that the state has ulterior motives, well, then the fact that for years prior to the signing of the Mulford Act, the FBI used COINTELPRO operatives to try and sabotage the Panthers' counter-communities. That should be all the context that you need to have created in order for you to put that picture together. This was very blatantly an attempt to quash what the state deemed to be a threat to their socio-political and financial interests. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be the Black Panthers expert, because admittedly my knowledge of the organization isn't what it could be. Most of my detailed knowledge about the Black Panthers comes from Karl Hess describing his activities in the New Left movements during the 70s, which I'm not going to go too much into detail with, since it's mostly not relevant to the subject of today's videos. His writings are easily accessible though, so I'll put a link to some PDFs and articles in the pinned comment underneath this video. However, something which Karl Hess was involved in and has been documented extensively is the Libertarian Alliance, which was established and briefly existed with the Black Panther movement, which had some major influence over the organization's activities. The reason I mention this is both because the pretend libertarians in the comments under the LP's tweet attacking the LP on the grounds that they're defending a Marxist organization, which they claim were coercing people to make their ends meet, even though the evidence for this claim is sparse, incredibly dubious, and not to mention that it would undermine their entire movement, since organizations which are financially dependent on parasitic means of obtaining profit are inherently unsustainable. And the Marxists who are trying to treat this tweet as a defense of Marxism as a political affiliation. Both of these positions are not entirely accurate. Regardless of what you think of this noted alliance or some of the Black Panther's philosophical leanings, it's historically inaccurate to claim that libertarian philosophy had no influence or connections with the Black Panther movement. Specifically, it's because the Black Panther movement didn't try to achieve its ends through legislative or any other coercive means that attracted some libertarians, such as Hess or Robert Lefebvre. Before I completely ditch this subject, can we bring Karl Hess to Count Dankula's attention? Because this guy is easily deserving of the absolute Mad Lad title, and it's an absolute shame that most people, even in libertarian circles, aren't familiar with this guy's ideas and his exploits. Anyway, this is ultimately what makes the post here from the Libertarian Party so interesting. There is absolutely nothing remotely inconsistent with what the Black Panther movement, the activities they were involved in, which invoked the wrath of the US government, and the principles of libertarian philosophy, establishing a subversive and productive counter-economic infrastructure with the intention of undermining the state's influence over society by jeopardizing its ability to fund itself, and using force to defend oneself in pursuit of the same ends, is an explicitly libertarian strategy to undermine political rule, despite the movement being one which openly had Marxist influence, which is a demonstration of two major points that destroy the state's narrative of a party system, the Hegelian dialectic it's created, trying to divide people against one another based on material preference by convincing people that policy plans proposed by political parties are the only means to have their interests met. Because if it wasn't for legislation threatening you in order to associate in ways that you don't want to, how would you be able to associate in ways that you want to? Showing that libertarian means will always establish libertarian ends, and in turn, that coercive means can only result in authoritarian ends. In other words, philosophies and material interests are not inherently tied together, as someone who operates around the assumption that politics are a legitimate concept or are the only way that you can have your interests met would assume. And having a clearly defined philosophy or material interests is not a necessary antagonism against someone who has a different material interest or a conflicting set of principles. Political rule is the antagonism of non-state actors in terms of what prevents us from living peacefully and comfortably while operating in accordance to our own interests. There is no reason at all why the pursuit of what you you deem to be a profitable means that someone else has to be coerced either directly or indirectly by legislative fiat, legal privilege, finance manipulation, or using front groups to screw with the market in a way which forces people with certain interests to behave in manners which they don't otherwise derive a sense of profit from. So the Black Panther movement's actions were not only perfectly compatible with libertarianism, but were a shining example of agorism in practice, and show how one can undermine the state and state aggression from any internalized worldview you approach this story from, and in a stateless society would be a perfect demonstration for how you can achieve profitable ends for yourself and like-minded individuals through establishing a new model of organization to cooperate with others in society, even if you aren't necessarily an Austro-Libertarian. Which, for the record, in case there are any new viewers watching who aren't familiar with my regular content, thanks for watching, it's greatly appreciated. But also, when I'm using the term profit in reference to economizing, I'm using it in the context of the Austrian methodology, in which profit is the exchange for something that is internalized as being less desirable in exchange for what is perceived to be something more desirable. Just wanted to clarify because the term profit has a different meaning depending on the context, the framework that you're approaching the discussion from, and I have a funny feeling that this video is probably going to end up getting a lot of attention, more so than my usual essays, from people who are Marxists or boomer conservatards that like to think of themselves as libertarians. So, anyway, the Libertarian Party's intention in tweeting this was likely to try and make a statement about how the LP has consistently supported my Second Amendment, and that Republicans, along with the NRA historically, have been proponents of using state aggression to try and stop people from being able to legally own guns, which anyone with an IQ of over 50 already knew. Not necessarily even particularly educated people. I'm not suggesting everybody knows about the Mulford Act or the history behind the Black Panther movement. Just the fact that states operate around convenience, essentially, and might makes right, and there's also nothing that would really stop them for doing that. So, it's not too hard for someone to put together the idea that if it became inconvenient for the state for a certain group of people to legally be able to carry guns, then, they're gonna make it difficult for those people to do so. But anyway, the Libertarian Party ended up, for a brief moment, giving the world a glimpse of actual libertarian philosophy due to unwitting implications which they likely didn't think through, since, as stated in the beginning, doing so runs into direct conflict with their own interests as a political party. Political parties are state-established organizations which share an interest with the state. In fact, the state established them for the sole purpose of trying to grant legitimacy to the underlying narrative behind its socio-political order. The state needs people to see non-state actors as antagonists to their own interests so that the state can present itself to the population as a means to have their interests protected. And it goes without saying, but I wouldn't consider the vast majority of Black Panther philosophy to be agreeable. And many aspects of their philosophy, not the means which they operated around, but their philosophy, runs into conflict with libertarian philosophy. But the point is that because they utilized a libertarian strategy and libertarian means, they were, for a time, reasonably successful in achieving their ends, and their ends could be considered no way objectionable by philosophical libertarians. Also, there seems to be a popular misconception in the comments, and the self-identifying libertarians objecting to this don't seem to question it, but that the reason the state targeted the Black Panther movement was because they were influenced by Marxism. This narrative doesn't stand up to scrutiny, though, because firstly, this assumes that the state views Marxist philosophy as a threat, and based on how Marxist philosophy tends to be promoted in academia, the media, and even in the algorithms of state-manipulated social media outlets online, this doesn't seem to be consistent with something that the state deems to be a threat. In fact, quite the contrary. The way that the state treats Marxism is consistent with something which it views to be a useful tool towards achieving some sort of desired ends, which also explains why the neo-Marxist intersectional social justice variant particularly, i.e. the type of Marxism which tries to argue that everything which exists in some sort of political class dynamic, is the main one which is so widely propagated. The other reason that this narrative doesn't check out is because the state clearly treats some Marxist organizations differently than others. For example, the mayors of cities where Antifa riots take place issue stand-down orders to the police departments in almost every instance where this takes place. Frankly, the states don't really seem to care that much about philosophies which affirm the legitimacy of political rule, regardless of what their specific idyllic revealed preferences for what they think the state ought to do is. What they do care about is people subverting their ability to continue functioning. Anyway, that's all for today's video. If you liked it, please comment, rate, and subscribe. This was my first video on the new computer, which is a big part of the reason why it took so long to actually get another video up. I set myself up a new computer, and on this one, I'm using a different editing software. I used to use something called HitFilm Express 4, and this video was made using Sony Vegas, so tell me what you think of the Sony Vegas videos. It's gonna be the new editing software that I use from now on. Other than that, we have 4 essays in the work currently. I might be putting out some more news videos here, but you got a lot of stuff to look forward to, and, you know, I'm sorry if it takes a little bit longer than usual for them to come out, because on top of all of this, I've got, you know, work to juggle around. Anyway, see you all next time.